Okay, this video is to demonstrate using a sampler, both Logic's quick sampler and multi-sampler. It's worth me mentioning at the start what I mean by a sample and a sampler. A sample is simply an audio recording, a capture of audio, be it a single hand clap, be it a snare drum, be it a full take of a piano recording. These are all samples, they're all audio recordings. We can load them into a sampler, which is very similar to a synthesizer, but instead of using oscillators to generate the sound, we have audio recordings. We can then still use them in the same ways, run them through filters, use envelopes and LFOs, and so on and so forth. So I have three different samples here. I have some drums which sound like this. I have a pad that sounds like this. And I have an acoustic guitar that sounds like this. I'm going to start off with the pad. So to load a sound into the quick sampler or the mono sampler, I'm simply going to drag and drop it into this space here. If I click and drag, we see this list appear, which gives us a bunch of options for using a sampler. I'm going to choose this top one at the top, the Quick Sampler Original. When it's loaded the sample, it'll open up the sampler plugin, which looks like this. Now, if I start playing some notes on my keyboard, we'll hear the sample played back. Let's try a high note. The higher note I play, the quicker it'll pass and the higher pitch it'll be. Whereas if I play a low note, it'll play it slower and lower. This is the classic mode, where it repitches according to what note we play on a keyboard. There is also the one-shot mode, which means that when I press a key, it'll play it from start to finish. Whereas in the classic mode, if I release my finger like so, it'll suddenly stop. The one-shot mode is great for things like drums, where you don't want your kick or snare drum or clap to kind of stop halfway through the sound. You want it to play it in its entirety. For something like this though, where it's got an actual tone and I'm trying to make a sound from it, I'll stick to the classic mode. Finally, there's the slice mode. This isn't really coming to use here, but what it does is it chops up a sample, most of the time things like drums or vocals, and arranges them as individual notes. We'll come onto that mode in just a moment, but for the time being, we'll stick with the classic mode. The first thing to note is I can edit the start and stop points of my sample using these tilde markers here. If I bring this to here, for example, it'll play from that point. Or to here. I can adjust where the sample starts and ends. Equally, I can use these markers here to apply a fade, so it has a nice easy fade in and fade out. These are just like the attack and release on an envelope, just an easier way of handling them. Once I've started playing around with these parameters, in Logic's sampler, it gives you a few options here where you can edit them quite meticulously, where you adjust them very specifically to be particular fractions of a second for your fades and your start and stop points, or of course you can use them more easily just by clicking and dragging. To get rid of this view, simply click the X. So far, this feature is very common on all samplers. You simply load in your sample, you can decide when it starts and stops and how much of a fade there is. There are a few other options though, for example the directionality of playback. At the moment it's playing forward. It starts here and moves forward, but I can change this to reverse. For this example it doesn't sound very different, but for something like drums or vocals we'd hear it would sound very different. Finally we have the option to loop. If I turn on loop, I have the option again to go forward or reverse, or even to alternate. I'll start it with forward, and as soon as I do, this pops up. I can then choose a section that I'll want it to loop. It'll start here at the start point, and as soon as it enters the loop zone, it'll then loop back to the start of the loop and keep looping that one section, like this. Again, I can adjust these loop start and loop end parameters down here and click the X to get rid of those. Let's change it from forward to alternate. That means it will bounce back and forward in that area there. This is quite handy when, for example, if you wanted to sample an existing track from jazz from the 1970s or a synth track from the early 90s, whatever it might be, you could find a recording of an isolated part, like a synth part, and make a whole tone from it. Using the loop bar, your start and stop points, and arranging them creatively, you can get some good results. To create a successful loop point, make sure you pick 2 points that are quite similar in amplitude. We can see here it's pretty even throughout, whereas if I put my end point, for example, over way back here, where there's a silence, we'll hear that silence as it loops around. So I'm going to keep it nice and concise, just like so. Using this method, I can create a continuous tone that will fade and sustain as long as I'd like it to. All these parameters so far are universal across hardware samplers, software samplers, be they in Logic, Ableton or any other. You can adjust your start and stop points, whether or not it loops, and the start and stop point of the loop. You can also adjust the directionality of your loop as well. Some samplers will also have a flex option. Now this means when I play higher or lower on the keyboard, rather than playing slower, we can keep it in time. With this mode, I'm going to leave it off, but if I were to click this button, I can adjust just how quickly it passes through, and as a result, I can make it stay at a continuous level, and it won't go faster or slower depending whether I play a high or low note. I've just turned it on, and it's now going to follow the tempo. I can adjust the speed if I'd like to. If I now go very, very high or very, very low, it'll play at the same rate, despite being higher or lower. This does mean some kind of flexing takes place. There is an algorithm, it sounds more glitchy, but does sound more direct and continuous across all the different pitches. Great. Down here then, with our LFOs, pitch, filter and amp, we have a lot of the same controls that we had on RetroSynth and ES2. We have an LFO here, where we can adjust the speed of the LFO, the shape of the LFO, what waveform it uses, whether it fades in, and where we're routing it to. Just like on the ES2, we're choosing where it's heading to and what it's applying to. So for example, LFO1, let's choose a target. Let's get it to change the loop start and end, and I'll get it to maybe go for about half a bar. And that way, this will then, hang on, let me just reset that. Sample start, there we go. And if I adjust this amount, it'll constantly adjust the start and stop point of my sample by 50%. I can do the same things with my filters, where I have, for example, a longer amplitude attack, like so. So it has a bit of a fade in. Or I can get rid of the sustain, so it's quite quick. Just like on the RetroSynth and ES2, I can shape my amplitude envelope to create a long sustained sound or a short and plucky sound. And again, exactly like with ES2 and RetroSynth, I can use my filter in the same way. Let's bring in a filter, let's use a low pass here. And I can adjust the envelope depth, how much this is affecting the filter with this dial here. As soon as I start to bring this up, we can see this kind of orange line appear, showing me where it's starting and where it's ending. Let's bring it a bit quicker. And make it a bit more extreme now. We can see the cutoff starting here and arriving here, depending on what time value you've set here. If I make this very, very short, it'll be very quick, whereas if I make it very long, we'll see it take a long time to arrive back to there. There is one other envelope we can play around with here, which is the pitch envelope. And as you might have guessed, it affects the pitch. We can adjust the overall pitch using the coarse and fine and hold semitones, or fine tuning. And again, we have that glide option or glissando. However, we can apply a pitch envelope, so our pitch will start high and go low. Let's make it quite extreme and quite long as well so we can hear it. Equally, if I go the other way, I'll get the inverse, where it'll rise and do the opposite shape. Just like that. This is often useful for drums to get more your kick or snares more impact by giving them a slight bit of a pitch bend at the start and making it quite quick. You get a slight impact. This gives your drums a bit more punchiness and makes them a bit more extreme. Excellent. Finally, we have the mod matrix here, where we can adjust all of our parameters such as velocity, pitch bend, all that kind of thing, and attach different elements to it. That's the quick sampler, but we can use a multi-sampler, which is a slightly more expanded version of the quick sampler, to make interesting results. What I'm going to do for that one, I'm going to add a new software instrument track, and rather than dragging it into the empty area like I did before, I'm going to select the sampler brackets multi-sample from the list here. Once I've loaded that, I'm then going to go ahead and open up the sampler. And again, it looks very similar with a slightly different layout. We have all the same things we had before, our filters, in fact we've got 2 filters now, our envelopes and our mod matrix, but we also have things like mapping and zone. We have a few more controls. So this time I'm going to bring in my guitar loop here, drag and drop that in, and that'll be my sample I'm working with. Just like before, I can adjust the start and stop points, the fades, the loop points, all that kind of stuff. I can, however, also assign different zones. So at the moment, it'll only play when I play C1, which is down here. If I play a D1, we don't hear anything. So what I can do is I can assign whether I want that to be the whole keyboard or just part of the keyboard and have a different sample in this area, or I can even adjust how hard I press it could affect it. So if I, for example, said that I want this to be triggered every time the velocity is higher than about 56 or lower than 56, that means it'll only play if I play the note softly. If I bring in a different sample, like the float pad, and pop that, say, there, then I'll have a different sound on these keys. If I want the velocity to be just a certain range, I can tell it to go from there, and again I can stretch the range to spread over different keys. This means some of these low notes will play just the alt pop acoustic, some of these high notes will play just the float pad, and some of them will play both. It depends then how hard I hit the key. If its velocity is below 56, it'll play the acoustic guitar. If it's above 56, it'll play the pad. I can use this then to create quite complex and layered samplers. Finally, we can use the slice mode to chop up a sample. Again, we can do this with the quick sampler or the multi-sampler. I'm just going to grab this drum sample I've got here and drag it into the quick sampler for the sake of ease. Once it's in the sampler, it's guessed correctly because it's quite spiky, quite a few harsh transients. Let's load it into the slice mode, but again I can change this to one shot or classic if I'd like to. If I now play different keys on the keyboard, I'll have that sample chopped up, and each individual hit I can change the start and stop points just by moving these little kind of yellow targets around. Just like before, I can apply pitch envelopes, filters and all sorts, but rather than re-pitching with a different key, it'll play a different sound, a different part of the sample. With this I can adjust the sensitivity to the transients. So if it's more sensitive, there'll be more spikes and more that will react to. A lower sensitivity will only pick up the higher and more obvious transients. Alternatively, I can divide it by beat divisions so they're all nice and equal. And those divisions can be crotchets, quavers, anything I like. This works quite well if you've got a nice continuous sample that you want to chop up that isn't very rhythmic. If you have something like a beat, like a drum loop like I've got here, transients tends to work quite well. Alternatively, we can do equal divisions of any denomination, just slice it up into 16ths or 19ths or 5ths. Or of course we can manually do it as well and add our own. One last thing I want to mention here is the Drum Machine Designer, which is a slightly more reduced version of the sampler and is very, very common for things like finger drummers. If I drag or add a new track, and I'm going to select an empty channel strip for this one, in my inspector I'm going to select near the bottom of the list Drum Machine Designer. Now you may have used this before. Essentially this is a blank pad that we can assign individual sounds to. I could just grab a kick, for example, and then play that kick, and then go to my next slot here and select a snare, for example, and play those on my keyboard, and I can build a whole kit this way. We don't have to use drum sounds. It of course recommends drum sounds because we're using it as a Drum Machine Designer, but you can load any sound you like. So if, for example, I grab my pad, I can drag and drop this onto one of these pads just here, and that will now be loaded in as a playable sound on the F#1. Once it's in there, we'll see it load in. There we go. Great. As you can now hear, it's playing it in full because it's in one-shot mode. If I go to QSampler main, I'll see the same detail I had on the quick sampler, or the QSampler detail, I'll get the bottom half as well. There's also a few basic controls for things like reverb and pitch and filters, things like that. The point being here, we have lots of individual samplers lined up, that are then triggering individual sounds, be they kick drums, snare drums, pads, whatever we like. We can use this to create chopped up rhythms, to reorganize existing patterns, to sample non-melodic things or real-world found sound, things like the sound of a twig hitting a lamppost, whatever it could be. It could be something melodic, it could be something traditional, or something completely out there. Using these tools, we can give them some pitch data, we can give them some interesting qualities, we can stretch them, we can apply different kind of layers to them. So if you hit this harsher or softer sound, we can get different zones reacting, and it gets very, very complex. The point being here is you can take any sound and treat it in the same way you would a sound in a synthesizer, run it through filters, envelopes, and LFOs.